What would you do if the only inheritance the world offered you was a locked stone tower on a dead hill, and the man who handed you the key laughed while he did it? For Elowen Hart, 19 years old and freshly turned out of the only house she had ever called home, this wasn't a hypothetical. It was Tuesday. She had exactly $14 folded into the lining of her coat, a brass surveyor's compass on a leather thong around her neck, and a piece of paper that said she was now the legal owner of an abandoned observatory on Hollowmark Ridge, a place she had paid $8 for at a county auction when no one else raised a hand. The town of Fenwick Junction, Colorado, in the autumn of 1897, called it a fool's purchase. They said the door hadn't opened in 22 years and that whatever was inside had rotted or been robbed a long time ago. But something waited behind that iron-banded door, something the old man who built the place had sealed away with a grief no ledger could measure, and a fortune no thief had ever found. Settle in, pour something warm, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because this is a story about what a patient young woman can pry out of a locked room, and out of a life that everyone else had already given up on. Elowen Hart had not always been alone. For the first 17 years of her life she had lived in a low, whitewashed house at the edge of Cartonwood Bend, where her father, Silas Hart, kept a surveyor's shingle over the door and a drafting table under the window. Silas was a land surveyor by trade, a quiet man with ink-stained thumbs and a laugh that came slowly, like water finding its level. He had married late, buried his wife 2 winters after Elowen was born, and raised the girl himself with the patience of a man who was used to measuring things that would not be hurried. He taught her to read a chain and a rod before she could read a novel. He taught her the difference between magnetic north and true north, and how a good surveyor learned to trust neither entirely, but to keep faith with both. By the time she was 12 she could sight a level line across a quarter-mile of sagebrush and know within an inch where the stake ought to fall. By the time she was 15 she could reduce a set of field notes into a plat map that a courthouse clerk would accept without a second glance. The tools of Silas Hart's trade filled the small back room of the whitewashed house, a Gunter's chain coiled in its leather bag, a plumb bob polished from 30 years of thumbwork, a transit theodolite that he cleaned every Sunday whether it needed it or not, and a set of drafting pens laid out on a felt cloth like a surgeon's instruments. But the one thing he loved best was the brass pocket compass his own father had carried west in '58, a small, heavy instrument no bigger than a biscuit, its needle floating in oil, its glass scratched but true. On the morning of Elowen's 16th birthday, Silas took the compass off his own neck and looped the leather thong over hers, and he said only this: "A person who knows where north is will never be entirely lost, even when the map is wrong. Even when the men reading it are worse." She wore that compass every day after. She wore it while she helped her father run lines for the new spur road east of the bend, and she wore it while she sat up with him the last 3 nights of his life, when the fever from a bad river crossing took him faster than the doctor could ride out to sea. He died on a Wednesday in April of 1895. Elowen was 17 years old, and she was, by the plainest reading of the world, entirely alone. Have you ever noticed how quickly a house goes quiet when the person who filled it with talk is gone? Silas Hart's brother came for her within a week. His name was Thaddeus Hart, and where Silas had been a slow, patient man who measured distances, Thaddeus was a fast, sharp man who measured accounts. He kept a mercantile and a small lending office in the town of Redwater, 62 miles south, and he arrived at the whitewashed house with a leather portfolio under his arm and a look on his face that suggested he had come to close out a warehouse rather than to bury a brother. He sold the surveying tools within a month. He sold the drafting table. He sold the house itself before the first frost, and he moved Elowen into a narrow room above his mercantile that smelled of kerosene and dried apples, and he told her she was welcome to earn her keep by sweeping the floors and keeping the ledgers straight, since her father had, in Thaddeus's phrasing, left the world with more debt than dignity. She did not argue. She swept the floors. She kept the ledgers. She discovered, in the keeping of them, that her father had left no debt at all, that the small mortgage on the whitewashed house had been paid off 2 years before he died, and that Thaddeus had pocketed the proceeds of its sale in full. She wrote nothing down. She said nothing. She only remembered, the way her father had taught her to remember a landscape, in exact measurements, in feet and inches, in numbers that would not soften with time. For 2 years and 4 months she lived in that narrow room. She turned 18. She turned 19. She learned how to be small in a house that did not want her, and she learned that a person can carry an entire second life inside her coat pocket if she is quiet enough about it. And then, on a grey morning in September of 1897, Thaddeus Hart called her down to the office behind the mercantile, and he opened a ledger, and he settled her account. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He turned the ledger toward her and he laid one thick finger on a line of figures and he said, "I have carried you for 29 months, Elowen. By my accounting, that comes to $142 in room and board, less the value of your labor, which I have been generous in assessing. What remains owing to you, in fairness, is $14. He counted the bills out onto the desk between them, 110, for ones, and he pushed them across the wood with the flat of his hand. "You are of age. I have discharged my obligation. There is a stagecoach north at noon." She looked at the money. She looked at him. She said, "Yes, sir." She did not cry. She did not ask about the house in Cartonwood Bend, or the surveying tools, or the 2 years of ledgers she had kept for him without a wage. She went upstairs to the narrow room and she packed a small carpet bag with what she owned, 2 dresses, 1 pair of boots, a wool coat, a tin cup, her father's field notebook, a folded plat map of Cartonwood Bend that she had drawn herself when she was 14, a packet of drafting pencils, and, at the bottom of the bag beneath everything else, the brass pocket compass on its leather thong. She was on the noon stage. She did not look back at the mercantile as it pulled away. Where would you have gone, if you had been her? With $14 and no living kin and a country the size of a continent opening out in front of you. Elowen went north because north was the direction her father had always spoken of with a particular tenderness, up past the Arkansas headwaters, into the high dry country where the government surveys were still incomplete and the maps still had honest blank spaces on them. The stage carried her 2 days and a night through country that grew leaner as it went, from the Cartonwood bottoms into scrub pine, from scrub pine into the pale, wind-scraped grass of the high plateau. She slept sitting up. She ate a boiled egg and a piece of hard bread that a widow across the aisle pressed into her hand without a word. She spent $1.40 on the fare and arrived, on the evening of the second day, in the town of Fenwick Junction, a rail siding, a livery, a hotel, a saloon, a courthouse the size of a schoolroom, and a scatter of frame houses arranged around a single dusty crossroads under sky so wide it felt like a judgment. She took a bed at the boarding house for 20 cents a night. In the morning she walked to the courthouse, because the courthouse is where a surveyor's daughter goes when she is trying to understand a place, and she asked to see the plat books. The clerk, a thin man with ink on his cuffs, looked at her over his spectacles and let her in without asking her business. She spent 4 hours turning pages. She learned that Fenwick County had been mapped in a hurry in the 70s by a federal team that had missed at least 2 creek beds and misplaced 1 ridge. She learned that a great deal of land in the county was held by absentee owners in Denver and Chicago. And she learned, on page 116 of the 3rd book, that a parcel of ground known locally as Hollowmark Ridge, 41 acres, with 1 stone structure described as Observatory, derelict, was scheduled for tax auction that very Friday, 3 days hence, at a minimum bid of $8. She asked the clerk what an observatory was doing on Hollowmark Ridge. He looked at her for a long moment before he answered. "That," he said, "would be old Dr. Ansel Merivale's business, miss, and Dr. Merivale has been dead these 22 years. Nobody's been inside that tower since the day they carried him out of it. Doors iron-banded. Keys lost. The county's tried to sell that parcel every 3 years since '75 and no one's ever bid on it. Not once." "Why not?" she asked. The clerk took his spectacles off and polished them slowly on his sleeve. "Because," he said, "folks around here believe that whatever Ansel Merivale was doing up on that ridge, he didn't want company for it. And whatever he left behind, he didn't want found." On Friday morning she stood in the back of the courthouse room with her carpet bag between her feet and her hand closed around the compass under her coat, and when the auctioneer called out the Hollowmark parcel and asked for an opening bid of $8, she raised her hand. No one else raised theirs. The gavel came down. She counted out $8 in coin and small bills, and she signed her name, Elowen Hart, of no fixed address, on the deed. A man in a good black coat at the front of the room turned and looked at her with the flat, appraising interest of a man who had just watched something valuable slip past him, and she did not yet know his name, but she would learn it. His name was Colonel Bertram Vance, and he owned the bank, the freight line, and 3 of the 5 men on the county commission, and he had been trying to buy Hollowmark Ridge for $6 for 19 years. He caught her on the courthouse steps. He was smiling. "Miss Hart," he said, "a moment. I understand you've just purchased the Merivale place. A charming impulse. I'd be pleased to take it off your hands this afternoon for, let's say, $12. A $4 profit inside of 1 hour. Not a bad morning's work for a young woman traveling alone. She looked at him. She looked at the compass on its thong, invisible under her collar, but she felt its weight against her breastbone the way her father had taught her to feel the plumb-line's weight in her hand. She said, "Thank you, Colonel. I believe I'll hold on to it a while." He kept smiling, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "As you like," he said. "Do let me know when you change your mind." Have you ever met a man who smiled at you like that? And did you know, the way she knew, that he had already decided to make you sorry? Hollowmark Ridge lay 6 miles northwest of town, at the end of a wagon track that had not been graded in a decade. She walked it. She carried the carpet bag in one hand and a canvas sack of provisions, flour, salt pork, coffee, a tin of matches, a hatchet, a coil of stout rope, a lantern, and 3 candles, in the other, and she covered the 6 miles in a little under 3 hours. And when she came up over the last rise and saw the tower for the first time, she set the bags down in the grass and simply looked at it. It was made of pale local sandstone, cut and fitted without mortar, 3 stories tall and round as a grain silo, standing on the crown of the ridge with the sky behind it and nothing else for a mile in any direction. A conical wooden roof, weathered silver, capped it. High up on the south face, a slit of a window showed where the telescope had once looked out. At the base, a single iron-banded oak door, black with age, faced east. There was no lock plate. There was no keyhole. The door was simply banded shut with 4 flat iron straps that had been hammered into the stone itself, and someone, Dr. Ansel Merivale, she supposed, in the last hour of his life, had welded the straps to their pins with a blacksmith's forge weld that had, by the look of it, never been broken. She walked all the way around the tower. She counted her paces. 41 feet in circumference. She put her hand on the stone. It was cold. She put her ear against the door and she listened, and she heard, or thought she heard, the very faint whisper that a large enclosed space makes when the wind moves across an opening far above. Behind the tower, downhill and half hidden in a stand of stunted pines, stood a small stone caretaker's cottage. 1 room, a fireplace, a rope bed frame with no rope, a stove with a broken door. It had a roof, more or less. It had walls. It would do. She spent the first 3 weeks making the cottage livable. She patched the roof with cedar shakes. She split herself with the hatchet. Working from a plank, she pried off the collapsed woodshed. She rewove the rope bed with cord she twisted from strips of an old canvas top. She scrubbed the stove flue clear with a wire brush she made by unwinding a length of fence wire and binding it to a stick. She hauled water up from the seep spring at the base of the ridge, 2 buckets at a time, 400 yards each way, and by the end of the first week her palms were split and her shoulders ached in a way that woke her in the night. By the end of the second week the splits had closed into calluses. By the end of the third week she no longer noticed the 400 yards. She ate salt pork and cornmeal mush. She rationed the coffee. She counted her money every Sunday evening by lantern light and she watched it shrink, $4.80, then $3.10, then $2.45. She did not, in all that time, try to open the door. She walked around the tower every morning at first light and every evening at dusk, and she looked at it, and she listened to it, and she waited for it to tell her something she did not yet know how to hear. On the 22nd day, an old woman came up the wagon track leading a burro loaded with 2 sacks of feed corn. She was small and brown and bent, with a face like a dried apple and hands that looked strong enough to twist iron. She stopped at the edge of the yard and she looked at Elowen for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "You're the surveyor's girl. From down at Cartonwood Bend. I knew your daddy." Elowen said, "Yes, My name is Hesperdoon. I live 2 ridges over. I brought you some corn because a person can't live on salt pork forever and expect to keep her wits. Set it inside." The old woman did not move to help carry the sacks. She watched Elowen carry them one at a time into the cottage. Then she looked up at the tower, and she said, in a voice that was suddenly not quite conversational, "Ansel Merivale used to tell me that the sky was not the only thing worth looking up at. He said the ceiling knows things the floor doesn't. You remember that, girl? The ceiling knows things the floor doesn't." Elowen said, I don't know what that means." Hesperdoon smiled without any teeth showing. "You will," she said. "Or you won't. Either way, it's yours now." And she turned the burro around and walked it back down the track without another word. That night, lying on the re-woven rope bed with the lantern turned low, Elowen thought about the low point she had reached, the aching hands, the shrinking money, the iron-banded door she could not open, the sense that the town 6 miles away was waiting for her to give up and walk back, and she thought she might, in fact, give up. She was 19 years old. She had $2.45. She had a compass and a field notebook and a tower she could not enter, and she was, for the first time in her life, honestly frightened. Have you ever been that tired? So tired that quitting felt like the only clean thing left to do. She did not quit. In the morning she made coffee and she walked out to the tower for her dawn circuit, and this time, because the light was low and coming in from the east at a hard slant, she saw something she had not seen before. Along the north face of the tower, about 8 feet up from the ground, a thin line of pale green moss ran in a perfectly straight horizontal band, exactly the width of a hand, for a distance of about 6 feet. Nowhere else on the tower did moss grow. The stone was too dry, too well drained, too high on the ridge. But there, in that one band, moss grew, because behind that band of stone, something was damp. She stood and stared at it, and she felt her father's voice in her head as clearly as if he was standing beside her. Water always tells the truth, Elle. Stone lies. Wood lies. Men lie. Water tells the truth every time. If it's damp where it shouldn't be, then something on the other side is different from what you were told. She walked back to the cottage. She got the hatchet. She got the coil of rope. She got the lantern and the 3 candles and her father's field notebook and a stub of drafting pencil. She got the brass compass from around her neck and she held it in her palm and she watched the needle settle, and she walked back to the tower, and she began, at last, to work. The first thing she did was measure. She paced the tower's circumference again, 41 feet, and she divided it into 8 equal arcs and marked each one with a peeled stick driven into the ground. She sighted a level line with her eye, using the compass held flat as a rough transit, and she confirmed that the band of moss was exactly 8 feet, 3 inches above the base of the wall on the north face. She wrote everything down. She was, at that moment, no longer a frightened girl with $2.45. She was Silas Hart's daughter, running a survey, and a survey did not know how to be afraid. She could not break the iron bands on the door. She had tried once, with the back of the hatchet, and the hatchet had rung against the iron like a bell and left no mark at all. But the tower had been built without mortar, sandstone blocks fitted dry, one on the next, held by their own weight and the precision of their cut. And where the moss grew, something had been different. Something had been fitted differently. She climbed up to the moss line using a scaffold. She built from 3 fallen pine poles lashed together with the rope, and she ran her fingers along the seams between the stones, and she found it, one block, no larger than a loaf of bread, whose seams had been packed not with dry stone dust but with a soft grey mortar that had, over 22 years, absorbed just enough seep from the winter frosts to grow moss on its outside face. A patch. Somebody had cut a block out of the wall and put it back and mortared it in. She worked on that block for 2 days. She used the hatchet head as a chisel and a smooth river stone as a maul, and she chipped the old mortar out of the seams a 1/4 inch at a time. She worked from dawn until her hands could no longer close. She slept. She woke and worked again. On the afternoon of the 2nd day the block moved, a bare 1/2 inch, and she felt the give of it and she knew. She wedged the hatchet in and levered, and the block slid out into her waiting hands, and she lowered it carefully down onto the scaffold, and she looked into the hole. Cold air came out. Cold air, and the smell of old paper, and the smell of oil. She lit a candle. She held it to the opening. The hole was not a hole into the tower itself. The tower's inner wall was another 2 feet in. The hole was into a hollow space between the outer wall and the inner wall, a space no more than 2 feet wide but running, by the sound of her voice when she spoke into it, all the way around the tower and down. A double wall. Ansel Merivale had built his tower with a double wall, and no one in Fenwick Junction had ever known it. She lowered the candle on a string. 6 feet down, the light showed her the top of a wooden ladder, fixed to the inner wall, dropping into the dark. She tied the rope to the scaffold. She tied the other end around her waist. She put the compass inside her shirt against her skin. And she went down. The ladder held 22 rungs. She counted them. At the bottom she stood on a stone floor and she lifted the candle and she saw that the space widened at the base of the tower into a low, round chamber tucked beneath the tower's floor, a chamber no one above ground would ever have known was there, because no one above ground had ever thought to look for a room under the room. The chamber was perhaps 12 feet across. It had a stone bench along one wall. It had a small iron stove with a flue running up into the double wall and out through, she realized now, a chimney disguised in the tower's decorative cap. It had shelves. And it had, on the shelves and on the floor and on the bench, the whole quiet accumulated life of a man who had gone to some considerable trouble not to be found. She set the candle on the bench and she lit the other two, and she stood in the middle of the chamber and she looked. There were books. 41 bound volumes, she counted later, astronomy, mathematics, botany, 3 volumes of Shakespeare, a Bible with a woman's name in it, a book of poetry in Spanish. There was a brass telescope, small enough to carry, in a fitted wooden case. There was a set of navigation charts of the Chilean coast, rolled and tied with red string. There was a violin in a black case, the strings gone slack but the wood still sound. There were 3 tin canisters of tea. There was a leather apron of the kind a blacksmith or a chemist would wear. There was, on a lower shelf, a wooden box the size of a large book, and when she lifted it she knew from the weight what was in it before she opened it, because her father had once let her lift a strong box full of payroll silver and she had never forgotten the particular density of coined metal. She opened the box. Gold. Not a fortune out of a storybook, not chests spilling over, but a careful, counted, working fortune. 218 $20 gold pieces, stacked in paper tubes of 10, and beneath them a smaller pouch containing 47 Mexican silver dollars, and beneath that a folded bank draft, still legible, drawn on a Valparaiso house for the sum of £1,200 sterling, made payable to bearer. She sat down on the stone floor with the box in her lap and she did not move for a long time. And then, because she was Silas Hart's daughter, and because a survey is not finished until every corner has been walked, she got up and she kept looking. And on the top shelf, behind the volumes of Shakespeare, she found a flat tin document case. Inside the case was a single sealed envelope, the wax still whole, and written across its face in a careful, sloping hand were the words, "To whoever finds this room." She broke the seal. She sat on the stone bench. She held the candle close, and she read, "To whoever finds this room." If you are reading these words, then you have been more patient and more observant than the men who came looking for me in the summer of 1875, and you have earned, by that patience alone, the right to what is in this chamber. My name is Ansel Merivale. I was born in Portsmouth, England, in the year 1818, and I am, at the writing of this letter, 57 years of age and not likely to see 58. I have been many things in my life, a ship surgeon, a naturalist in the Galapagos, a mining assayer in the Chilean Cordillera, and at the last a builder of small towers on empty hills in a country that was kind enough to let me disappear into it. I want you to know 3 things, whoever you are. The first is that the gold in the box beneath the shelf was earned honestly. It is the sum of 11 years of assay work in the Copiapo silver country, paid to me in coin because I did not trust banks, and carried north with me when I came to this territory in 1872. I have paid every tax I was asked to pay and I owe no man a debt. The gold is clean. Use it without shame. The second is that I did not build this tower to look at the stars, though I have looked at them from it and been grateful. I built it because in the year 1859, in Valparaiso, my wife Inez and our daughter Clara, who was 4 years old and afraid of thunder, drowned in the harbor when the schooner Reliance broke her moorings in a winter gale and went down within sight of our house. I could not reach them. I stood on the shore and I could not reach them. After that I could not any longer live in a house that had windows facing the sea, and I could not live in a town where people would ask me kindly how I was. I came north, and further, until I found a ridge with no water anywhere near it and a sky so wide that a man could lay his grief down under it and not have to pick the whole of it up again in the morning. I built the tower with my own hands over the course of 4 summers. I banded the door shut on the day I finished the inner chamber, because I did not want to be interrupted, and I came and went through the double wall by the same route you came in by. I am sorry for the trouble. I could not think of another way. The third thing is this. I have watched, from the slit window at the top of this tower, the town of Fenwick Junction grow for 11 years. I have seen the freight road come through, and the rail siding go in, and I have seen men become powerful in that valley who were not powerful when I arrived. I will name one of them. Bertram Vance, who calls himself colonel though he was never in any war I could find record of, has, in the years I have watched him, foreclosed on 11 families in this county whose only crime was a poor harvest, and he has paid the sheriff and 2 of the commissioners to look the other way while he did it. I have their names written in the ledger on the middle shelf. I did nothing about it in my lifetime because I was a man who had already lost everything he loved and I could not find in myself the strength to fight for people I did not know. That was my failure, and I own it. Whoever you are, reading this, I ask only this of you. Take the gold. Take the silver. Take the draft. Take the books, if you like books, and the telescope, if the sky is any comfort to you. But before you take any of it for yourself, see the 11 families paid back what Vance took from them. Their names are in the ledger. The amounts are there too. Do this thing, and the rest is yours, freely and without condition, from a man who is grateful, at the end, to have found a way to be of some use to somebody. Make this place live again. It has been dead long enough. Yours, in whatever way a stranger may be yours, Ansel Marivale, Hollowmark Ridge, September the 14th, 1875. Elowen read the letter twice. She read it a third time. Then she folded it, and she put it inside her father's field notebook, and she put the field notebook inside her shirt against her skin, next to the compass. And she climbed the ladder back up, and she came out into the daylight on the north face of the tower, and she sat down in the grass with her back against the warm sandstone, and she looked out over the valley toward Fenwick Junction, and she thought about 11 families, and she thought about Colonel Bertram Vance, and she thought about what a person is supposed to do when a dead man hands her a debt he could not carry. What would you have done? She went into town the next morning. She did not take any of the gold. She took, in her pocket, a single $20 piece, one out of 218, and she took the ledger from the middle shelf, and she took the letter, and she took her father's field notebook, and she walked the 6 miles back to Fenwick Junction with the wind at her back. She did not go to the sheriff. The sheriff was on the list. She went, instead, to the office of a young lawyer named Josiah Pell, who had come out from St. Louis 2 years before and hung a shingle and been more or less starving ever since, because Colonel Vance did not care for young lawyers from St. Louis and had made sure Fenwick Junction understood. Josiah Pell read the letter. He read the ledger. He looked up at Elowen, and he said, very quietly, "Miss Hart, do you understand what you are handing me?" She said, "I understand that 11 families are owed money, and that I would like your help paying them back. I can offer you a fee of 10% of the total restitution, payable when the work is done. I would like receipts from each family, signed and witnessed, and I would like copies filed with the territorial court in Denver, not with the county court here. Can you do that?" He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Yes, Miss Hart. I believe I can." The work took 4 months. Josiah Pell rode out to each of the 11 families in turn, from the Vestergaards on the North Creek to the widow Alma Trask on the South Fork, and he laid out what he had, and he paid what was owed, with interest at 4% a year, calculated honestly from the date of the original foreclosure, from a strongbox that Elowen had carried down from the Ridge 1 gold piece at a time. Word began to move through the county the way water moves through dry ground, slowly at first, and then all at once. People began to come out to Hollowmark Ridge. A carpenter named Odi's Brun arrived one morning with his tools and, without saying more than "Morning, miss," rebuilt the collapsed woodshed in a single day and refused any pay beyond a cup of coffee and a look at the telescope. A blacksmith named Ephraim Coyle came out and cut the 4 iron bands off the tower door in an afternoon, using a portable forge he set up in the yard, and he too took nothing but coffee and the loan of a book of Spanish poetry that he returned 3 weeks later saying he could not read a word of it but had liked the shape of the letters. The widow Alma Trask, whose farm Vance had taken and whose farm Josiah Pell had bought back for her out of the Ridge's gold, came up the wagon track every Wednesday with a covered basket, biscuits, salt-cured ham, once a whole peach pie, and she never stayed longer than it took to set the basket down and say, "I'll be going, then." She did not thank Elowen. She did not need to. The basket was the thanks, and Elowen understood that, and understood, too, that this was how a community was actually built, not with speeches, but with baskets, and cut iron, and rebuilt woodsheds, and small transactions of respect passed hand to hand until they added up to something a bank could not foreclose on. Colonel Bertram Vance heard, of course. He heard the way such men always hear, from a clerk, from a bought commissioner, from the sudden careful silence of men who had been happy to shake his hand a month before. He came out to Hollowmark Ridge on a cold morning in December. He did not bring the sheriff. He brought only himself, in the good black coat, on a good black horse. And he sat the horse at the edge of the yard and he looked at Elowen where she stood in the doorway of the little cottage with her father's compass around her neck on the outside of her coat now, in plain sight. He said, "Miss Hart, I understand you have come into some money." She said, "I have come into some obligations, Colonel. The money was incidental. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You will not enjoy this county for long. I have friends." She said, "You had friends, Colonel. You have neighbors now. There is a difference." And she stepped back into the cottage, and she closed the door, and she did not watch him go. He was gone from Fenwick Junction by spring. Not driven out, she never asked for him to be driven out, but simply, quietly, made irrelevant. The territorial court in Denver, when Josiah Pell's filings reached it, opened an inquiry into the foreclosures. 2 of the county commissioners resigned. The sheriff was not re-elected. Vance sold his interests at a loss and moved east, to Kansas City, where, Elowen heard some years later, he had opened a smaller bank and been moderately unsuccessful at it. She never saw him again. She never needed to. A year passed. By the autumn of 1898 the tower on Hollowmark Ridge had been opened at the door as well as at the moss line, and the double wall had been made into a proper stair, and the inner chamber had been cleaned and aired and turned into a working library that any child in Fenwick County could ride out to and use on any Saturday of the year, free of charge, provided they signed the book on the way in and put back what they took down. The stone cottage had been enlarged into a 4-room house with a proper roof and a proper stove and a north-facing window with a drafting table under it, because Elowen had, in her second month on the ridge, taken up her father's trade again in the evenings, and had begun to accept survey work from the ranchers on the plateau who had, until then, been paying Denver men twice the price for half the accuracy. She charged fair rates. She kept honest field notes. She wore the compass on the outside of her coat now, always, and she wore, on a second leather thong beside it, a small carved wooden bird, a Chilean sea swallow, no bigger than her thumb, that she had found on the day she cleared the top shelf of the inner chamber, tucked inside the violin case, wrapped in a scrap of a child's blue dress. She understood, without having to be told, whose it had been, and who had carved it, and why. ODI's Brunn came for coffee every Tuesday. Ephraim Coyle came every second Friday and always brought a new question about the Spanish poetry. Alma Trask's Wednesday basket had, by the end of that year, become a Wednesday supper, taken at Elowen's table by whoever was on the ridge that evening, which was often 4 or 5 people and once, on a warm evening in September, 11, one for each of the families Ansel Merivale had asked her to make whole, all of them at her table at the same time, and no speeches made, and none needed. Hesper Doone came up the track once more, in October, and she looked at the tower with its door standing open and its inner light burning at dusk, and she said, "The ceiling knows things the floor doesn't, girl. I told you." And Elowen laughed, for the first time in a great while, and said, "Yes, you did." On a still evening in November, a little more than 14 months after she had stood in the courthouse in Fenwick Junction and raised her hand for an $8 bid, Elowen Hart climbed the inner stair of the tower alone and came out at the slit window at the top, and she sat on the sill with the sky going lavender in the west and the first star showing over the plateau, and she took 2 things out of her coat pocket and she laid them side by side on her palm. The first was the brass pocket compass on its leather thong, heavy, scratched, its needle still true, that Silas Hart had put around her neck on the morning of her 16th birthday and told her that a person who knew where north was would never be entirely lost. The second was the small carved wooden bird, a sea swallow, no bigger than her thumb, that Ansel Merivale had carved for a daughter he could not reach across a harbor in a winter gale 40 years before, and had wrapped in a scrap of blue cloth and left on a shelf for whoever might one day be patient enough to find it. 2 men. 2 gifts. One had taught her how to find her way. The other had taught her what to do when she got there. She thought about them both for a long time, and she thought about her $14 and her $8 bid and the 218 $20 gold pieces that had, in the end, not belonged to her at all but had passed through her hands to 11 families and one small library on a hill. She was 20 years old now. She had been cast out, at 19, with $14 to her name and a compass around her neck, and she had paid 8 of those dollars for an abandoned observatory no one could enter, and she had, in the end, made a place. She had made a place. The star over the plateau brightened. She closed her hand around both objects at once, and she went back down the stair to the light of the lamp in the window and the sound of Alma Trask's voice in the kitchen setting out the plates. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end of this story of patience and inheritance, of what one young woman found when she was patient enough to listen to a wall. If Elowen Hart's journey moved you, if you found something in the way she carried a dead man's promise the same way she carried her father's compass, please give this video a like and share it with somebody in your life who has ever been handed a thing the world called worthless and found in it, quietly, the thing they were meant to build. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you won't miss our next tale. A story, next week, about a young widow in the Oregon rain country who buys a broken lighthouse for $11 and finds, behind its rusted lens, a letter that has been waiting for her name for 30 years. Until then, tell us in the comments, what have you carried out of a hard chapter of your own life that you did not, at the time, know was going to matter? What small thing, given to you by somebody who loved you, has turned out to be the thing that pointed you north? We read every comment. We are grateful for every one of you. Be well. And remember, the ceiling knows things the floor doesn't. Keep looking up.